He wind-swept across the dusty frontier trading post, carrying sand through the gaps between the wooden buildings. Horses stamped impatiently beside the hitching rails while merchants shouted prices and wagon wheels groaned over the hard-packed earth. Near the edge of the busy market stood a young orc woman named Mara. She looked exhausted. Her dark green skin was covered in dust, her simple brown dress had been patched more times than she could remember, and her long black hair was tied loosely behind her shoulders. But the saddest thing about her was the way she kept looking at the horse standing beside her. Flint was an old chestnut gelding with a white mark running down his nose. He was not beautiful by the standards of wealthy ranchers. His ribs showed slightly, one ear was scarred, and his legs were stiff after years of hard travel. But to Mara, Flint was family. He had belonged to her father. After her father's death, Flint had been the only thing she had left. Now she had to sell him. A merchant walked around the horse, examining his teeth and hooves. 10 silver, Mara whispered. The merchant laughed. 10. For this old animal. Mara swallowed. He can still work. He knows the mountains. He carried my father for years. That was years ago, the merchant replied. I'll give you 6. Mara shook her head. Please. I need 10. The merchant shrugged and walked away. Mara lowered her eyes. She had only enough food for another day or two. Winter was coming, and she had nowhere to stay. If she kept Flint, neither of them might survive. She placed one trembling hand against his neck. I'm sorry, she whispered. Flint gently nudged her shoulder. Mara closed her eyes. Then a quiet voice came from behind her. I'll give you 10. She turned. A tall Apache mountain rancher stood several steps away. His name was Elias. He wore a weathered brown coat, worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. A rifle rested safely across his saddle, but his expression held no threat. His dark eyes moved from Mara to Flint. Mara immediately became cautious. You'll buy him? Elias nodded. 10 silver. Hope briefly appeared in her eyes. She reached for the coins when Elias placed them in her palm. Then he noticed her expression. She wasn't relieved. She looked heartbroken. Elias studied her for a moment. You don't want to sell him. Mara quickly wiped her eyes. I don't have a choice. Why? She hesitated before answering. Because I have nowhere to go. The words came out so quietly that Elias almost missed them. Mara explained that she had been traveling from settlement to settlement since losing her family. Work had become scarce. Food was expensive. People saw an orc woman alone and assumed she was either trouble or someone they could take advantage of. Flint was the only reason she had survived this long. But now she believed selling him was the only way to buy enough food to reach winter. Elias looked at the 10 silver coins in her hand. Then he gently closed her fingers around them. You keep them. Mara stared at him. What? I said you keep them. But you bought Flint. No. Elias looked toward the mountains in the distance. I didn't come here to buy your horse. He looked back at her. I'd rather give you both a home. Mara couldn't speak. She had heard promises before. Every promise in her life had eventually carried a price. But Elias simply held out his hand toward Flint's reins. Come with me, he said. Both of you. For the first time in years, Mara wondered if those words could actually be true. Mara did not trust Elias. She followed him anyway. The journey toward his ranch took most of the afternoon. The trading post slowly disappeared behind them as the trail climbed into the mountains. Tall pine trees surrounded the narrow path, and the air grew colder with every mile. Flint walked behind Elias's horse, carrying Mara's few belongings. Mara kept looking back. She expected Elias to change his mind. She expected him to turn around and demand the 10 silver coins. But he never did. When they finally reached the top of a long ridge, Mara stopped. Below them stood a small mountain ranch. There was a wooden cabin, a barn, a fenced pasture, a well, and several stacks of firewood protected beneath a roof. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. It wasn't grand. But it was safe. Mara stared at it in disbelief. "You live here?" Elias nodded. "Been here 7 years. Alone?" "For most of them." Mara looked toward the cabin. Something about the place felt different from every settlement she had passed through. There were no shouting men, no locked gates, and no frightened animals. Elias led Flint toward the barn. "You can put him in there." Mara hurried after him. "Wait." Elias turned. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" He pointed toward the cabin. "The spare room." Mara frowned. "You have a spare room?" "I do." "And you're giving it to me?" "For as long as you need it." She studied his face. "What do you want in return?" Elias paused. "Nothing." Mara almost laughed. Nobody gave anything for nothing. Elias seemed to understand what she was thinking. "You can work if you want," he said. "There are fences that need fixing, animals that need feeding, and a garden that could use someone who knows what they're doing." Mara looked toward the small garden beside the cabin. It was almost completely overgrown. "You're not much of a gardener." Elias glanced at it. "No." For the first time, Mara smiled. It was a tiny smile, but Elias noticed. "You'll have food," he continued. "You'll have a bed. Flint gets a stall. That's all." Mara looked at Flint. The old horse had already begun drinking from a clean bucket. Her eyes became wet. She quickly turned away. That evening, Elias prepared a simple meal of beans, bread, and roasted meat. Mara sat stiffly at the table, barely touching her food. "You should eat," Elias said. "I am." "You've taken 3 bites in 10 minutes." Mara looked embarrassed. "I forgot how to eat without worrying someone would take the food away." Elias said nothing. Instead, he pushed the bread basket closer. Mara finally began eating. Slowly at first. Then faster. Elias pretended not to notice how hungry she was. After dinner, he showed her the spare room. There was a small bed, a wool blanket, and a wooden chest. Mara stood in the doorway. "This is mine. For now." She touched the blanket carefully. Nobody had given her a private room in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded. Then he walked away. Mara watched him disappear down the hallway. That night, she lay awake for hours. She listened to the wind outside and the quiet sounds of Flint moving in the barn. For the first time in a long while, there was no shouting outside her door. No one was coming to drag her away. No one was demanding payment. Still, she couldn't allow herself to believe it would last. At sunrise, Mara stepped outside. Elias was already repairing a fence. Without saying anything, Mara picked up a hammer. Elias looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know." She walked toward the broken fence. "But I want to." And for the first time, the lonely ranch began to feel a little less lonely. For several weeks, Mara began to believe that Elias's promise might actually be real. Every morning, she woke before sunrise and helped with the ranch. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, watered the garden, and repaired whatever needed fixing. Elias taught her how to handle the larger animals, while Mara taught herself which plants could survive in the mountain soil. Flint grew stronger too. His ribs were no longer visible, and his coat began to shine again. Sometimes Mara caught herself smiling when she watched him run across the pasture. She had almost forgotten what happiness felt like. Elias noticed the change. He never mentioned it. He simply left an extra cup of coffee on the table each morning and quietly repaired the loose window in Mara's room when the mountain winds became cold. Their friendship grew without either of them naming it. But one afternoon, everything changed. Mara was hanging freshly washed clothes near the cabin when she heard horses approaching. At first, she thought it was a neighbor. Then she saw 3 riders coming through the trees. Her hands froze. The smile disappeared from her face. One of the riders wore a black coat. Mara knew him. Her heart began pounding. She dropped the cloth in her hand. No. Elias was repairing the barn roof when he noticed her expression. Mara? She couldn't answer. The riders stopped near the fence. The man in the black coat removed his hat. There you are. Mara stepped backward. Elias climbed down from the roof. Who are they? Mara whispered, people I ran from. The tallest rider smiled. We've been looking everywhere for you. Mara's breathing became unsteady. You need to leave. The man laughed. You don't get to decide that. Elias stepped between them. This is private property. The rider looked him over. And you're the man hiding her. She isn't hiding. She belongs to the settlement. Mara's face hardened. I belong to myself. The rider's smile disappeared. You owe a debt. I owe you nothing. You know that's not how this works. Elias looked at Mara. Is there a debt? Mara hesitated. Then she nodded. Not money. Her voice trembled. They say I owe them because my father borrowed food before he died. After he died, they told me I had to work for them until the debt was paid. Elias's expression became cold. How long? Years. And you ran? Mara nodded. I tried to leave before. They found me. The rider leaned forward. She's coming back with us. Elias didn't move. No. The man's eyes narrowed. You don't understand what you're involving yourself in. I understand enough. The rider pointed toward Mara. She has no family. No land. No protection. Elias answered quietly. She has a home now. Mara stared at him. The word struck deeper than she expected. A home. Nobody had called anything hers in years. The riders eventually turned their horses around, but before leaving, the leader looked at Elias. This isn't finished. Elias watched them disappear into the trees. Only when they were gone did Mara finally breathe. That evening, she sat silently on the porch. Elias brought her a cup of warm tea. You should have told me. I was afraid you'd send me away. Why would I? Because trouble follows me. Elias sat beside her. Mara, trouble didn't create you. She looked at him. You're not a burden. Her eyes filled with tears. They'll come back. I know. And they'll hurt you. Maybe. She shook her head. You don't understand. Elias looked toward the dark mountains. No. I understand perfectly. Then he looked back at her. You came here because you needed somewhere safe. Mara whispered, yes. That hasn't changed. For the first time, Mara believed him. But deep in the forest, 3 riders were already making plans to return. And this time, they weren't coming to ask. The first snow arrived 3 weeks earlier than expected. One morning, Mara opened the cabin door and found the mountains covered in white. Snow rested on the pine branches, the fence posts, and the roof of the barn. Winter had come. Elias studied the sky. We need to bring everything inside. Mara nodded. They spent the morning carrying firewood, grain, and animal feed into the barn. Flint watched them from his stall, occasionally nudging Mara whenever she passed. By afternoon, the wind became violent. Snow slammed against the windows. The mountain trail disappeared completely. Elias looked outside and shook his head. We're trapped until the storm passes. Mara glanced toward the barn. Flint will be warm enough. He'll be fine. But later that night, Mara heard a strange sound. A horse coughing. She immediately grabbed a lantern and ran outside. Flint was shivering. His body was covered in sweat despite the freezing temperature. Elias. He rushed into the barn. What happened? He's sick. Elias placed a hand against Flint's neck. He's burning. Mara's face filled with fear. Can we get a doctor? Not in this storm. Then what do we do? Elias immediately began working. He brought blankets, heated water, and prepared medicine from the supplies in the cabin. Mara stayed beside Flint, rubbing his neck and whispering softly to him. You're not leaving me, she whispered. Flint struggled to breathe. Mara's eyes filled with tears. You're all I have left. Elias heard her. He stopped for a moment. You have more than that now. Mara looked at him. But before she could answer, the wind slammed against the barn doors. Elias secured them and returned to Flint. For hours, they fought to keep the old horse alive. Mara held the lantern while Elias worked. At one point, Flint collapsed. Mara cried out. No. She dropped beside him. Elias helped her lift the horse's head. Stay with him. I am. Talk to him. Mara pressed her forehead against Flint's. You remember my father? The horse breathed weakly. He used to say you were stubborn. A tiny smile appeared through her tears. He said that was why you survived. She stroked Flint's mane. You carried him through the mountains. You carried me when I was a child. Her voice broke. So you don't get to give up now. Elias watched silently. The storm continued through the night. By dawn, Flint's breathing had become steadier. His fever began to fall. Mara leaned against the stall wall, exhausted. Elias handed her a blanket. He's going to make it. She closed her eyes. Thank you. You saved him too. Mara shook her head. We saved him. Elias smiled. For a moment, everything was peaceful. Then Flint suddenly lifted his head. His ears pointed toward the mountains. Elias noticed. What is it? Mara stood. Outside, through the falling snow, came the faint sound of horses. Elias's expression changed. He picked up his rifle. Someone's coming. Mara's heart sank. She moved toward the barn door. Through the storm, 3 dark figures appeared on the trail. The same riders. They had found the ranch. Mara whispered, how did they get here? Elias looked at the impossible trail behind them. They must have followed our tracks before the snow covered them. The riders stopped near the fence. The leader shouted through the wind. Bring Mara out. Elias stepped forward. She isn't going anywhere. The man laughed. You can't protect her forever. Mara watched Elias standing alone between the ranch and the approaching men. Something inside her changed. For years, she had believed survival meant running. Now she had something worth staying for. A home. A horse. And someone who had never asked her to pay for his kindness. Mara stepped beside Elias. He glanced at her. You should stay inside. She shook her head. No. Her voice was quiet but firm. I've run long enough. The storm howled around them. The riders slowly advanced. And Mara realized that by sunrise, she would finally have to face the people she had spent years running from. The storm had weakened by sunrise, but the mountains remained buried beneath thick snow. Mara stood beside Elias on the porch, watching the 3 riders near the fence. The leader raised his voice. Send the orc woman out, and this ends peacefully. Mara's hands trembled. For years, those words would have been enough to make her run. But she looked behind her. The small cabin. The warm barn. Flint's stall. The garden buried beneath snow. This was no longer simply a place where she had been allowed to stay. It was home. Elias stepped forward. You've been told already. She's staying. The leader laughed. You think one rancher can stop us? No, Elias replied. He glanced toward the ridge. I think 3 men who trespass on another man's land are making a poor decision. The riders looked around. Mara heard movement in the trees. 3 ranchers from the neighboring valley appeared on horseback. Elias had sent word before the storm became too dangerous. The riders immediately became nervous. The leader pointed at Mara. She belongs to us. Mara finally stepped forward. No. Everyone became silent. She walked down the porch steps. Elias reached for her arm. Mara. She gently shook her head. This is my fight too. She stood at the fence. I don't belong to you. The leader sneered. You owe a debt. My father owed you food, Mara replied. He died. You made me work for years to repay something that was never mine. The man dismounted. You're an orc. You had no land. No family. No protection. Mara looked toward Elias. Then she looked back at him. I have all 3 now. The leader's expression darkened. You think this man owns you? No. Mara's voice became stronger. He never tried to own me. She pointed toward the ranch. He gave me a room when I had nowhere to sleep. He fed me when I was hungry. He gave my horse a warm stall. And he never once asked me to repay him. Elias looked at her quietly. Mara continued. You are the one who believes everything has a price. The leader reached for his weapon. Elias immediately raised his rifle. The neighboring ranchers did the same. For several tense seconds, nobody moved. Then the leader slowly lowered his hand. You'll regret this. Mara didn't step back. I already regretted running for too long. The riders turned their horses. Before leaving, the leader looked at Elias. This isn't over. Elias replied calmly. Yes, it is. The 3 men disappeared down the mountain trail. Mara remained completely still until they were gone. Then her knees weakened. Elias caught her before she fell. You all right? Mara nodded, tears running down her face. I was terrified. You were brave. I didn't feel brave. Bravery rarely feels brave. Mara laughed softly through her tears. Later that morning, Elias took her to the hill behind the ranch. The storm had cleared, revealing a breathtaking view of the mountains. Mara looked down at the cabin. I should leave. Elias turned toward her. Why? Because they've already brought trouble here. You didn't bring anything. They came because of me. They came because they wanted control. Mara lowered her eyes. I don't want to destroy your life. Elias was silent for a moment. Then he pointed toward the ranch. You helped rebuild that fence. Mara looked at him. You planted half that garden. She smiled faintly. You repaired the barn roof. You cooked the first decent meal I've eaten in years. Mara laughed. Elias smiled. Then he said quietly. You keep saying this is my home. He looked at the ranch. It isn't. Mara's eyes widened. It belongs to both of us now. She couldn't speak. Elias continued. Not because I rescued you. Because you stayed. You worked. You cared for this place. You made it feel alive. Tears rolled down Mara's cheeks. She had spent her entire life being told she was unwanted. Now someone was telling her she belonged. Mara looked toward the pasture. Flint stood there beneath the morning sun. For the first time, she understood the true meaning of Elias's promise. He hadn't bought her horse. He had given her a chance to stop surviving and finally begin living. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. The snow melted from the rooftops first, then from the fences and finally from the wide pasture behind Elias's ranch. Small green shoots pushed through the dark earth, and birds returned to the pine trees. For Mara, the world looked completely different. Only a few months earlier, she had stood at a dusty trading post, holding 10 silver coins and believing she had no other choice but to sell Flint. Now she stood in the same pasture, watching him run. The old chestnut horse was stronger than ever. His coat shone beneath the morning sun, and his steps were steady. Mara smiled. "You're getting too proud," she called. Flint stopped and looked at her as if offended. Mara laughed. "You know I'm right." From the porch, Elias watched them. The lonely rancher who had once spent most of his days speaking only to his animals now had someone beside him almost every morning. The ranch had changed too. Mara had planted a garden beside the cabin. Fresh vegetables grew in neat rows. She had repaired the chicken coop, painted the porch railing, and turned the empty spare room into a warm little sewing room. Even the barn looked different. Elias had never cared much about making things beautiful. Mara did. One afternoon, Elias returned from town carrying a small wooden box. Mara looked at him suspiciously. "What is that?" "Something for you." She opened it. Inside was a silver bracelet. Mara stared at it. "I can't accept this." Elias smiled. "You haven't even heard why I bought it." "Why?" "Because I saw it and thought you'd like it." Mara touched the bracelet carefully. Nobody had ever bought her something simply because they thought she deserved it. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded. That evening, they sat together on the porch. The mountains were glowing orange beneath the setting sun. Mara looked toward the pasture. "Do you remember the trading post?" Elias smiled. "The 10 silver coins." She nodded. "I thought you were going to buy Flint." "I remember. I was so desperate." "You were trying to protect him." Mara smiled. "I thought I was saving him." Elias looked toward Flint. "You did." She turned toward him. "But you saved both of us." Elias shook his head. "No." Mara frowned. "I didn't save you, Mara." He looked at her. "You saved yourself." "I just opened a door." Her eyes filled with tears. She looked down at the bracelet around her wrist. For so long, she had believed her worth depended on what she could give someone. Work. Money. Obedience. Debt. But Elias had taught her something different. A person could be valuable simply because they were a person. "You know," Mara said softly, "I never thanked you properly." "You've thanked me plenty." "No." She looked at him. "Not for the right thing." Elias waited. "Thank you for letting me stay when you had every reason to say no." He smiled. "I never regretted it." Mara looked toward the mountains. "I used to think home was a place you were born into." "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think home is the place where someone chooses to keep the door open for you." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he gently placed his hand beside hers on the porch railing. Mara didn't move away. Their fingers slowly touched. Neither said anything. They didn't need to. Behind them, the cabin windows glowed warmly. In the pasture, Flint lowered his head to graze. The mountains stood peacefully beneath the evening sky. Mara remembered the girl she had been at the trading post, the frightened young woman willing to surrender the last piece of her family for 10 silver coins. That girl had believed she had nothing. She had been wrong. She had possessed courage. She had possessed love. And, eventually, she had found a home. Elias glanced at her. Best 10 silver coins I never spent. Mara laughed through her tears. You never even bought the horse. No. He smiled. I got something better. What? He looked at the ranch. A family. Mara rested her head gently against his shoulder. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. And as darkness settled over the ranch, Mara finally understood that home was never about 4 walls, a piece of land, or a name written on a deed. Home was the place where she no longer had to run. The place where Flint could grow old in peace. The place where her past could finally remain behind her. And the place where someone had looked at her horse, and said, I'd rather give you both a home. For the first time in her life, Mara believed him completely.